How do you feel like most women feel about this? Like, are they silent? Are they being bullied? Is it split half and half? Like, what's your sense about what the majority of women feel about trans women competing against women in pro sports?
It probably depends on their political ideology more so than sex, because I do see men also very upset about the fact that trans female athletes are being allowed to compete against non-transgender female athletes. But I would say most women are furious about this. And especially among female athletes, you have some woke female athletes who are saying, oh, we're totally fine with this. But my sense is they're fine with it because they've already made it and it doesn't affect them. So this is not just in the realm of sport. You see this with regard to women's spaces, things like locker rooms and bathrooms and prisons. And when women do speak up about this, they get called all kinds of names. I mean, in my book, I talk about how I used to really identify as feminist. I'm critical of feminism because there's an element of science denial to me that comes along with modern day feminism that I'm not a fan of. But I do think it's quite ironic that you see women speaking up about women's rights and women's physical safety, and then you have these individuals shouting them down and calling them all kinds of horrible misogynistic names. And these individuals doing that are individuals who were born male.
Has ideology kind of creeped into the science? Because I've seen some scientists saying there are no differences. I've seen studies saying that now they're saying the brains of men and women are the same. Is this scientific, or is this ideology or a fear of backlash?
These are activist scientists who are pushing a very specific agenda, a very specific political agenda, and they have weaponized legitimate scientific journals as a way to legitimize their views. So something like talking about biologically based sex differences in the brain, on average, they do exist. I've written extensively about this. This is also in my book. And nowadays, when you look at the scientific papers that are coming out and also the way that journalism reports on it, people just say that gender is a social construct when it's not. It absolutely isn't. If you know anything about the scientific research, you cannot say that with a straight face. So people who do say this, they know it's because it's going to help their careers. Maybe they think that they're doing something good for society by saying that gender is a social construct, because that way maybe they could argue more so for treating men and women as equal. But I would argue it's actually sexist to say that women have to be the same as men in order to be given equal treatment. I don't see why we can't say, yes, there are these on average differences, again, that don't say anything about any individual person. But that's not to say just because someone is stereotypically feminine or has more female typical interests, that doesn't make her lesser than a man.
Yeah. And this issue of gender and sex, this is what they hang their hat on, right? So that part I get. They're saying, okay, your sex is what you're born, and then your gender is how you feel, and therefore when you transition, you're fulfilling what your gender is. But I can't help but notice that when they transition, they transition to the opposite sex, and there's two of those, and they act like one of the two. So can you just explain what's the difference between gender and sex in from their standpoint? What are they claiming?
Well, I'll start from a scientific perspective and then I'll go to what's the various interpretations that activists have taken. So, from a scientific perspective, sex, biological sex, is determined by gametes. So, these are mature reproductive cells. So, you have eggs and you have sperm. So, sex is binary. It is not a spectrum. It is not socially constructed. And then from there, gender identity refers to how someone feels about their sex. So for most people, their gender identity is in alignment with their birth sex. But for some people, including trans people and some intersex people, so intersex means that someone has a combination of both male and female characteristics or anatomy. So some people identify as the opposite sex. So someone might be born male and identify as female, or vice versa. You see this broadening of the term transgender to refer to people who identify as a third gender now. So people who are non-binary, so they say that they identify as either both male and female, or neither, or a little bit of one or the other. Sometimes they'll go by they them pronouns. There's a whole other big long list potential pronouns that they can go by, or how they identify when they say that they're third gender. But for most, I mean, historically, trans people are people who identify and want to live as and transition to the opposite sex.
Right. So, yeah, sometimes it just seems like bad grammar. When you're saying, hey, refer to me as them, you're like, I only see one of you.
Yeah.
And I'm from New York, so I'd probably call you yous anyway. Can I use yous instead of them?
You might have to ask them first, honestly. But what's even more, I mean, it's just bizarre to me. Now in journalism, you will see this because some people identify as multiple pronouns. So they'll identify as she, they. So they'll be referred to as she at one part in the article and then they in a different part of the article. And you're reading it and you're thinking, wait a minute, who is this? And it takes a second to realize this is the same person as before, but there's no explicit explanation. And I'm also thinking, why can't you just, if you want to go by they, I will use the pronoun someone wants me to use, but it's just confusing. And like you said, it's grammatically nonsensical.
Is it, do you think it's also a good option just if they say to call me them, just to walk away and say, okay, I'm not going to deal with that, or I'm going to leave this party because it's not lit?
Well, I think it can be a signal of, in some cases, it's people who are legitimately struggling with their gender, and I do think they deserve compassion. But in a lot of cases, especially when it's older people, say, who are not teenagers and who have developed in their identity, they know who they are. It's a way to signal that they are extreme left, progressive. And I'm a liberal. I feel that being on the left has really been co-opted by these fringe, crazy people, and they will use their gender identity or multiple pronouns as a way to signal their politics and to signal that they're somehow really open-minded. But it's really about, I think, narcissism and too much time on their hands.
Yeah, just for me as a comic, it's just a little confusing if I'm doing crowd work and I say, hey, where are you from? And they go, who's you? Are you referring to us? And I'm like, you're sitting at a table alone. And then it just becomes confusing. And I feel like maybe we could do a modern day who's on first with that. I said you. No, it's them. But I'm talking to you. What? So you're saying if I'm watching Real Housewives with my wife and I start to get into it and say Erica knew about her husband stealing all that money and I start to talk like that, I shouldn't transition? I should just wait? I'm just having a feminine moment?
I mean, you're free to do as you like, and if you'd like to transition, I fully support you in that. But I do find a lot of this ideology very regressive and sexist, because just because a man has female typical interests, say, although I'm sure there will be some women who will get mad. I personally love the Real Housewives franchise, but if there might be some women who find that, say, well, not all women like that. That's true, but anything that's, say, stereotypically feminine or that women on average like or find interesting, or the majority of people who like something are female. If a man likes it, doesn't mean that he's not a man. He can still be a man and just happen to have this interest.